Good afternoon and welcome to the National Archives. I'm live mic'd here. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to have you here in person, and a special welcome to those who are watching us on YouTube. I'm pleased to welcome Larry Tye to talk about his recent book, Bobby Kennedy, The Making of a Liberal Icon. After the talk, Larry will be signing copies of the book upstairs outside the archive shop. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you about two programs that will be coming up soon in this theater. Tomorrow at noon, Arthur T. Downey will discuss his book, The Cold War, Law, Lawyers, Spies, and Crises. Downey's latest work is a look at the people and doctrines that helped avoid global catastrophe during the Cold War. And at noon next Wednesday, September 21st, Laura Weinrib, the author of The Taming of Free Speech, America's Civil Liberties Compromise, will talk about how a surprising coalition of lawyers and activists made judicial enforcement of the Bill of Rights a defining feature of American democracy. To learn more about these and all of our programs and exhibitions, consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online at archives.gov. There are copies in the lobby as well as sign-up sheets where you can receive it by regular mail or by email. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our outreach and education activities, and their applications for membership also in the lobby. At the time of his death in 1968, Robert Kennedy, senator and presidential candidate, was regarded as a leader in the fight against poverty and for civil rights in America. But the young Bobby Kennedy, who started his political career in the 1950s, was a very different person. Author Larry Tye traces the evolution of Robert Kennedy from cold warrior to progressive hero in his new book. Marvin Kalb, senior advisor at the Pulitzer Center, wrote, Larry Tye, with the eye of a good reporter and the diligence of an accomplished scholar, writes a fascinating, timely report on the other Kennedy, the one named Bobby, who started out supporting Joe McCarthy and died fighting in the anti-Vietnam War crusade. Bobby has always deserved a crackerjack bio. Tye has delivered it. The reason I'm so excited that Larry is here is I'm always pleased to welcome someone who has used our records extensively in order to generate new scholarship. And Larry used the collections at both the Kennedy Library and the LBJ Library, including he had access to the Bobby Kennedy papers, which aren't open to the public yet, which is really nice to hear. So please welcome Larry Tye.
Thank you. So the one thing you didn't mention is that I also used the Nixon Library, but not until after the fact, in a very unusual experience, is delivering a lecture on Bobby Kennedy with pictures of Richard Nixon up adorning all the walls around you. And on the way up to the stage when I was at the Nixon Library, the wonderful person from the Nixon Library Foundation asked me, is there a warm Richard Nixon, Bobby Kennedy story you could tell? And unfortunately, I'm either not a good enough reporter or no amount of digging could have found that, but there was no warm story there. What I would like to do, I presume, judging from the age of the audience, that many, if not most of you, lived through the Bobby Kennedy era. Did anybody know Bobby personally out here? Nobody. So what I want to do is take you through three pivotal moments in Bobby Kennedy's life that, to me, capture who he was when he started out his career, who he was in the process of becoming, and who he was at the moment of his death in 1968. And if you would come with me for the first moment back to 1957, and we're going to go to the little airport in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And this was the closest airport to a place where an important funeral was happening in Appleton, Wisconsin. Anybody remember who in 1957, who would have been buried? Joe McCarthy, yes. And where was he? He was from Appleton. What do we remember about Joe McCarthy?
Congress needs a tail gunner.
Congress does need a tail gunner. And Joe McCarthy, whose name became associated with the expression, okay to be here?
Better to be up on stage.
Better to be up on stage, okay. Great. I'm going to be up on stage. And And what I would like to do is remind you, so in 1957, in Green Bay, Wisconsin, an enormous military jet flies into the airport in Green Bay, and it's bringing to the funeral the kinds of people you would have expected to go to that funeral. Out of the plane pop 19 US senators, 7 congressmen, and a bevy of other luminaries from Washington, most of whom had supported McCarthy all the way through, most of whom were Republican, and most of whom didn't give a darn that McCarthy had been censured by the Senate and been repudiated by much of America by then. So all of these people do what dignitaries always do when they fly into a funeral like that. They unload from the plane, and there are a bunch of big black stretch limousines, and they get into those and they are whisked to nearby Appleton, Wisconsin. And the airport goes quiet. And that plane goes quiet, and this looks like there's nobody else left in the airport at all, and certainly not on that plane. And then one last solitary figure walks out of the plane. He is a short guy, he is a thin guy, and his name is Robert Francis Kennedy. And he came to that airport that day in spite of the fact that his big brother Jack said, "Don't go to that airport today, don't go to that funeral." And Bobby did what younger brothers often do when they get important advice from older brothers. They listen to it very seriously, and they proceed to ignore it. Bobby comes to that funeral. There's nobody left in terms of a black limousine to take him to nearby Appleton. There are no taxis left, so he hitches a ride with the one guy he can find there, who happens to be a reporter for the Milwaukee newspaper, and he's driving him in the perfect kind of Kennedy car, which is a car with no top. And they whisk at high speeds off to the funeral. Bobby gets to the church, and all the dignitaries are down front, and Bobby is up in the choir loft where nobody can see him. At the graveside service, all the dignitaries are over here, and Bobby is off over there where nobody can see him. After the funeral, there are all the reporters. If you remember back to the kinds of coverage there would have been in newspapers for a funeral like that, it was very boring coverage generally and very standard. And one of the things they always did was they listed all the dignitaries who were there to celebrate the death or to mourn the death or whatever they were doing for the death of Joe McCarthy. And there was one name that never showed up in those stories, and that was the name Robert Francis Kennedy. Because in what was sort of standard practice back then, Bobby had gone up to the reporters and said, "Would you mind not including my name?" And reporters back then gave deference to politicians, and when those politicians were named Kennedy, they gave special deference to him, and Bobby Kennedy's name never showed up. And luckily for me, 50 years later, the reporter who took him in that car from the airport to the funeral is still alive and discussed not just that he had taken him, but that Bobby had asked him never to say that he had been there. I tell you this story for 2 simple reasons. One reason says something that I think is a good thing about Bobby Kennedy, which is Bobby Kennedy, the very loyal guy. Bobby Kennedy, 6 or 7 years before, had been anybody here, by the way, from the University of Virginia? Great, so I can say anything I want about so Bobby Kennedy, who had wanted to go to Harvard Law School, ended up at the University of Virginia Law School. And he ended up not at the top of his class and not at the bottom, but solidly in the middle, a very undistinguished law school graduate who, when he needed a job, it didn't hurt that his dad had given a lot of money to Joe McCarthy, and Joe Kennedy could call Joe McCarthy and say, "Hire my son," and Joe McCarthy did. And Bobby Kennedy appreciated that. He felt he didn't just go to work for McCarthy because his dad said to. He went to work for McCarthy in part because he believed that Joe McCarthy was one of the only people in Washington who was taking seriously the communist threat. And not just the threat in the Soviet Union, but the threat behind the pillars of the State Department and maybe the National Archives and Records Administration. And so he went to work enthusiastically for Joe McCarthy. Joe McCarthy treated him well, and he stayed on for 7.5 important months in his career. And when Joe McCarthy was censured, to his credit, Bobby Kennedy wrote the Democrats' report, most of which was adopted by the Republicans. So Bobby Kennedy actually did understand by then that McCarthy had flaws. But he was not going to be told that he wasn't going to be there for Joe McCarthy at his funeral because he was a loyal guy. And disgraced or not, he was darn well going to be there. So that's the nice side of who Bobby Kennedy was in those early days. The other interesting side of who he was the guy who was thinking about spin. And he was going to be his brother's ultimate spinmeister, running his congressional campaign, running his Senate campaign, and most importantly, looking ahead from 1957, running the campaign that everybody with half a brain in Washington knew that Jack Kennedy had been planning half of his life for the presidency. And Bobby Kennedy knew it could be embarrassing to his brother, for his having been there and been written up being there at the McCarthy funeral. So he's the loyal guy. He's the guy who wants to be loyal but wants to also spin the truth on what had happened there. And those are two pieces of who Bobby Kennedy was in his early and formative years in 1957. I want you to move with me now to another part of the country, a whole lot closer to here, and we're going to go ahead to the year 1963. And we're going to pick a particular month in 1963 that something traumatic happened to Bobby and to the country, which is November 1963. This morning that we're going to visit him in November 1963, Bobby starts out the day, as he always did, working hard as hell at the Justice Department. And then he does what he often did at lunchtime, which is had his limousine and chauffeur take him from the Justice Department to Hickory Hill, the family estate over the hill from the CIA in McLean, Virginia. And he went for a swim, which was a nice thing to be able to do. If you had a wonderful estate and a swimming pool, you might as well take advantage of it at lunchtime. He goes in for a swim, he comes out, he changes his into dry shorts. He's probably having his tuna fish sandwich, and the telephone rings. And at the Kennedy estate at Hickory Hill, it was not a normal telephone. It was one of several hotlines to the White House. Much to the chagrin of Lyndon Johnson, Bobby Kennedy's home at Hickory Hill had more hotlines to the White House than the vice president's house did. And when that phone rang, it was generally not good news. And when that phone rang and Ethel said, "It's J. Edgar Hoover," it was never good news. J. Edgar Hoover, in a voice that Bobby would later describe as the same kind of monotone he might have used as if he had found another communist on the faculty of Howard University, J. Edgar Hoover says to Bobby, "Your brother has been shot." An hour or so later, a second call comes in and says, "Your brother is dead." Now, my guess is if I went around and interviewed everybody in this room, you would all remember it was our 9/11 moment. You would remember precisely where you were. You're shaking your head. Where were you?
I was teaching in Spokane, Washington.
And did that moment, was it a devastating moment?
Yes, particularly because one of my students was an Indian, and he said, "This reminds me of Gandhi's death."
So everybody has a story about where they were at that moment, but there is nobody, I hazard to say without hyperbole, that there is nobody in America who was more devastated by hearing that news than Bobby Kennedy. And yet he did something extraordinary. He rallied. He had suddenly lost, with this one phone call, his brother, his boss, his reason for being professionally ever since he had been involved with the congressional campaign, and his best friend. Bobby Kennedy, for the next month, did something extraordinary. He rallied instantaneously from the first phone call, and he rallied the family first of all. He points to brother Ted, and he says, "You'll go tell Mom and Dad what's happened." He points to Sister Eunice, and he says, "You will go start planning the funeral." Everybody in the Klan had a role, and just the way Joseph P. Kennedy had intended before he had his stroke, Bobby was the leader of the Klan with Joe gone, and he was the one handing out assignments. Everybody's falling apart. Bobby's got to hold them together. The country is falling apart, and for the next month, Bobby, I don't know if you remember again, this was probably the most televised event in American history, given that TV was relatively new as a medium, and everything was televised. The funeral was televised, the various services, eulogies were televised, and Bobby Kennedy for the next month was America's mourner-in-chief. He was the one at a point when the country had suddenly lost its young, charismatic, new frontier president, and had a guy sitting in the White House who may have been smart and may have known a lot, but he was not young, he was not New Frontier, and he did not generate the excitement that Jack Kennedy did. And the one who I think, even though he despised Lyndon Johnson, the one who conveyed the most legitimacy on Lyndon Johnson was the closest thing to the dead president, his brother Bobby. And for a month, Bobby held the country together. At the end of that month, the family started pulling it together, and everybody went back to their lives. The country was pulling it together, and people went back to their lives. At the end of that month, Bobby Kennedy crashed. And he crashed in a way that, as Ethel says today, that we would have described back then, only we didn't quite have the terminology, as serious situational clinical depression. He crashed. And his crash lasted for a full 6 or 7 months. Anybody remember here what Bobby did the first time he sort of started pulling it together? What was he running for? After lots of hemming and hawing and deciding whether to run for a senator from Massachusetts or Virginia or Maryland, what did he do?
Challenged Keating from New York.
Right. A white-haired, affable, sort of know-nothing guy named Ken Keating, who was sitting there and would have won easy re-election if it hadn't been the star Bobby Kennedy running. But even running for that election, which he announced, I think it was the end of August, maybe September, even that wasn't enough to pull him out of it. What pulled him out of it was halfway through the election, it looked like something traumatic could happen for a Kennedy, which was they could actually lose an election. And that was what, it was at Columbia University, sort of halfway through the election, when the polls showed he was in trouble, that Bobby Kennedy finally understood that it wasn't just Jack Kennedy that the crowds were turning out to cheer for, it was Bobby Kennedy. And he started taking on a different purpose in life. And I don't pretend to be a preacher or to know much about religion, but that was his epiphany moment as much as anybody could ever point to a single moment in a life. The Bobby Kennedy pre-1963 assassination of Jack Kennedy had some combination, like all of us, of toughness and tenderness, but the dial was skewed to the tough side. The Bobby Kennedy post-assassination was, number one, was reading for the first time. As some funny journalist from Massachusetts said, Bobby Kennedy suddenly discovered there was such a thing as a book. And Jackie helped point him to a particular kind of book, which was Greek tragedy. And he understood that the Kennedy family was, in a way, a story of Greek tragedy. It was hubris, it was losing everything, and it was trying to figure out how to rebuild. And the rebuilding that Bobby Kennedy did after his brother's death was not only a more tender Bobby Kennedy and a more contemplative Bobby Kennedy, it was a Bobby Kennedy who in an entirely new way related to the underdog. He had always, in a way, been the underdog brother in the Kennedy family, the underdog sibling, but after Jack's death, he had to redefine himself, and the evolution that was a lifelong process for him had its moment of greatest significance at our second moment in November of 1963. I want to take you now to our last moment. And our last moment is one that is very relevant. I know these are nonpartisan walls, and I'm not going to talk election stuff, but our last moment was an election 50 years ago that I think has a lot of resonant moments for an election today. And the Bobby Kennedy of 1968, anybody enough of a political fan of 50 years ago to remember how it was that Bobby entered, at what moment he entered that race? When was it?
After McCarthy did so well in New Hampshire.
Well, yes, that's exactly the moment. It was McCarthy did well. So the McCarthy we're talking about is not the one we started out talking about. This is another McCarthy. That was Joe, this is Gene, both from neighboring states in the Midwest. And this generally unknown senator from Minnesota challenges a president who in 1964 had won, I don't remember what percent, maybe 200% of the vote in 1964, but had won overwhelmingly, so overwhelmingly that he carried enough of the Senate with him that they had to set up an entire new row of seats for Bobby Kennedy, and I think it was Fred Harris and Walter Mondale. And so very popular presidents taken on by the senator writing one issue, the issue being anti-war in Vietnam. He comes close to beating LBJ when the Democratic votes were counted. When you added Republican write-ins, he actually beats the sitting president. And exactly 4 days after Gene McCarthy shows how vulnerable LBJ is, Bobby Kennedy jumps into the race. And he had been trying to outrun his entire life the label that he had gotten back in the early McCarthy days of being ruthless. He comes in 4 days after that primary in New Hampshire, and half of the public, all of the college kids he wanted on his side, and most of the press corps decided that Bobby Kennedy was in fact still ruthless. A telegram goes from Murray Kempton to Ted Kennedy saying that your brother's entry into this race shows that St. Patrick didn't drive all the snakes out of Ireland. Now, the only thing more funny in my mind than that was LBJ's press secretary, Lady Bird Johnson's press secretary, has this brilliant quote: "It took you 20 years to come out against McCarthy, and then you picked the wrong one." So that was the story the press reported. The true story of 1968 is the full 9 days before the New Hampshire primary, Bobby Kennedy was telling trusted journalists and others, many of whom are still alive to tell the story, that in fact he had decided incontrovertibly that he was going to run in that race. And instead of being ruthless, he was probably ham-handed in not declaring early, because he wanted to give Gene McCarthy, who had been taking on LBJ in this courageous effort in New Hampshire, he wanted to give him an open shot because he had earned it. And so instead of people saying, aren't you a nice guy for giving him an open shot, he starts out that campaign with the world thinking he's a bad guy. And as he said, I lost all the A students in college that I wanted with me, and the only ones that stuck with me were the C students. So that's what it started out in 1968. The moment I want to take you to is in April of 1968, where something very traumatic happened, kind of like what happened at our moment in 1963. And this is in the first contested primary for Bobby Kennedy in that campaign in '68. Anybody remember where he contested the first primary? Indiana. So in a state that has a good Massachusetts-bred Democrat like, well, I can't say Democrat, Massachusetts, okay, the Massachusetts guy, he knew about this much about Indiana. His farm policy, he once joked, blew away when one page of his speech blew away. He had no idea where the food on his table came from. He had no idea what to do in a state that was the birthplace of the John Birch Society and a much more conservative state than Bobby Kennedy was used to in New York or Massachusetts. And he was running a campaign not just against Gene McCarthy, but nobody here happens to remember the name of the favorite son governor.
Roger Brannigan.
Roger Brannigan. Very good. It was great. You're going to come up here in a minute, but that's, you're either going to come up here or you have to come to all my talks with me. That's the, so he's running against this popular, relatively popular, especially when he was sober, governor of Indiana, Roger Brannigan. So one night, Bobby Kennedy flies into Indianapolis in his wonderful campaign jet. And he is greeted at the airport by a young governor who went on to become a not-so-young senator named Richard Lugar.
Richard Nixon's favorite mayor.
Yeah, right, exactly. That was the... So Richard Lugar greets him at the airport, and he says to him, there's been a horrible tragedy. Martin Luther King has been shot and killed. He says, Bobby, you will not go in and give your planned speech tonight in the black community in Indianapolis because I'm worried that you won't come out alive and that you will stir up a riot if you go in there. And Bobby does what he had done with Jack's advice to stay away from the McCarthy funeral. He listens to it, he pretends like he's taking it seriously, and then he says, but here I go. He drives off with a police escort to the edge of the ghetto in Indianapolis, at which point the police peel off. And for the next 5 minutes, Bobby Kennedy delivers what may have been the single most pitch-perfect speech that a white politician has ever given to a black audience in America. And that speech, I'm going to read you the beginning of that speech, but that speech is something that in a moment in American history, when we are looking for the right words to respond to Baton Rouge, to respond to Dallas, to respond to St. Paul, to respond to Orlando, I would suggest that you think of these words in the context of what's going on today. And I wish I could do it. I'm from Massachusetts, but I won't even pretend to have a Bobby Kennedy accent. But I'm only going to talk to you for a minute or so this evening because I have some very sad news for all of you. Martin Luther King was shot and killed tonight. Now, he's delivering the speech from the back of a flatbed truck, and 90-some odd % of his audience doesn't know that Martin Luther King has been killed. And you can hear on the YouTube tape of this 5 minutes people in the background saying, no, no. And it just, the drama is extraordinary. And Bobby continues louder with his voice shaking. He says, for those of you who are black and tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. And I want to stop for another second to say this is the first time ever from 1963 to 1968 that Bobby Kennedy has ever talked publicly about his brother's death. And he still can't bring himself to say it was Jack Kennedy who was killed, or even to say it was my brother. It was, I had a member of my family. He goes on to say, what we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion to one another. So I ask you tonight to return home to say a prayer for the family of Martin Luther King. Yeah, it's true. But more importantly, to say a prayer for our own country, which all of us love, a prayer for understanding and that compassion of which I spoke. Now, I got to tell you, I've heard that speech, the live version of the speech, about 50 times. In every radio or TV interview I do, they play it on air. And I can't help, when I hear him delivering it, tear up each time, partly because the words themselves are so powerful, partly because I know that he had been given on his way to the ghetto that night by his staff prepared remarks that he was supposed to deliver. And when he got up on the back of the truck, he threw those away, and he did all of this spontaneously. But the reason that I tear up most of all is that night in America, in more than 100 cities across the country, there were race riots. Not too far from here in Washington, a piece of the city was burned down that took almost 30 or 40 years to recover in Adams Morgan and up 16th Street. That was a time, probably more than any single night in the country's recent history, where it looked like the country could go up in flames. There was one city in America that night that had a sizable African-American population that didn't riot. That city was Indianapolis, Indiana, and the reason was Bobby Kennedy. Barack Obama, when he went to the funeral in Dallas for the slain police officers, he delivered a 45-minute address that was a very powerful address. But in 45 minutes, he didn't come close to what Bobby Kennedy managed in 5 minutes. The people in the civil rights movement, from the early days of Bobby at the Justice Department, they were very skeptical. Bobby seemed more interested in whitewashing, and that's a bad word to use, but whitewashing his brother's record to look like he was a strong advocate for civil rights than doing anything about civil rights. And in the early days of the civil rights movement, most of Martin Luther King's young aides said Bobby Kennedy's no good. Martin Luther King said no, he has good within him, and it's up to us to find that good and pull it out of him. It is ironic that the moment he proved Martin Luther King right through the rest of his attorney generalship, and certainly as a US senator, but the one moment he proved him most right was at Martin Luther King's own funeral. From that moment on, through the rest of his campaign, through June of 1968, Bobby Kennedy was easily the single most popular white man in black America. But you don't have to trust me. Everywhere he campaigned in a ghetto that year, there was a sign that greeted him. And that sign said, white, but all right. Now, that might not sound like much, and it might almost sound like a joke. In 1968, for anybody to hold a sign that said anybody white, and certainly a white politician, was all right in that way, was making an extraordinary statement. And the only one who could have inspired that statement was Robert Francis Kennedy, not the guy in 1957, and not the guy in 1963 even, but the Robert Kennedy who was with us at the end of his life and at the end of his campaign. And I would like to end today by saying that I think that Robert Kennedy was on the verge of doing something that was extraordinary at the time of his death. He was on the verge, in today's terms, of uniting a lot of the people who we think of I don't remember what the term that Hillary, who was it that she said we threw in a basket? All of the Trump supporters were, all of the deplorables, right. So a lot of what she would have called deplorables, who were the angry white Trump supporters, who were the people who were with Bobby from 1957, because they remembered him as the cold warrior, the strong-minded Catholic, the guy who, in a later era, we would have called Reagan Democrats. They were with Bobby, but so were the liberals and the blacks and the Hispanics who were the Hillary Clinton, who are today's Hillary Clinton coalition. He was in the process of doing something exactly the opposite of what's happening in this political season. Instead of segmenting the electorate and dividing it, he was in the process of building bridges that had never been built. And we will never know, so I can say anything I want in terms of what the result of that might have been, but it sure as hell gave us hope that this 42-year-old guy who was taken away from us after that California primary could have done something extraordinary had he lived to see it through. And the words that I want to leave you with are the words of my favorite political columnist, Mark Shields, who said that he's been waiting for 50 years to find another tough liberal, or if you prefer, tender conservative, like what Bobby Kennedy represented in 1968. So I want to thank you, and if anybody has questions, I'd love to answer them. And if not, we could go and enjoy the beautiful day. Great. Thank you. Great. So we have, great. I'm sorry. Should we come to the microphones on either side? So my two sidekicks here, who are they're plants, by the way. This is Uncle Joe and Uncle Jim. And that's the,
There was an incident today largely forgotten when a veteran in New York died who had been a member of the Communist Party, and his family wanted him buried at Arlington, and it was only because of Robert Kennedy's insistence he overcame the opposition, and this veteran was buried at Arlington. I don't know if you deal with that in your book
Yes.
or not.
So the answer is, my recollection, and my recollection is terrible and everything, is that the guy's name was Thompson, and that everybody said, and everybody expected the old cold warrior Bobby Kennedy to say, this guy doesn't deserve. He was a communist, and why should we bury him at Arlington? And Bobby Kennedy, it was partly that this was the changing Bobby Kennedy, and it was partly that Bobby Kennedy all along had that tenderness in him. And he said, this guy fought for our country, and this guy will be buried at Arlington, and he was buried at Arlington. And I want the next time any of you go visit Arlington, go visit Bobby Kennedy's grave, because he could have had anything he wanted in those days in terms of the kind of grave site that's there. And look at the contrast between, I mean, he was not a president, Jack was a president, but look at the contrast between the grave sites for Bobby and for Jack. And this is not a question that you asked, but I'm going to answer it anyway. So Rose Kennedy had dreamed that one of her boys would go into the priesthood. And everybody disappointed her. She'd always thought that it should be Bobby, but that one of the boys. And I like to say that if Jack Kennedy had gone into the priesthood, he would have been the Pope, because that's who Jack Kennedy was. He was above things. He liked to be sort of in a leader and in a solo spot where nobody could question him. If Bobby Kennedy had been a priest, he would have been a parish priest. And that's exactly what the differences, I think, would have been in their presidencies. That Bobby Kennedy learned by being down on the ground level. Jack Kennedy may never have paid attention. He may never have answered. He was enough of a great politician, he wouldn't have answered one way or the other, because he wouldn't have wanted to have to answer that. Or he would have said, I'll decide that issue in 1964 when I'm reelected. If Bobby Kennedy had been elected president, he lacked the patience, and he knew how short life could be, that he would have done everything or tried to do everything he wanted to do in the first 15 minutes in the White House. And that's just who he was. Sir?
Well, first of all, I agree with you. My favorite columnist is Mark Shields as well, and I will tell him that you said that. I have two questions. The first question was, I happen to know Senator McCarthy. I didn't know him in '68. And sometimes we would eat lunch together, and he would divide the world. People would come in, and he would literally say, I guess it's my turn for an anecdote, and he would say he was with Bobby, or he was with me. And he didn't have that feeling about John Kennedy, who he served in the Senate with. He was elected, McCarthy was elected in '58. But with Bobby Kennedy, it was extreme animosity, and it never subsided. And I wondered if you talk about that in the book, the personal animus between the two. And the second question is, everybody who lived through that time remembers the last words he said, and now on to Chicago. And I'm from Chicago, and I was in Chicago in '68. What was his feeling? Humphrey had not entered one primary. Johnson was supporting him. Was it realistic to think that even though he had won the last primary in California, that he could win with the unit rule, with Johnson supporting Humphrey, that even if he had won that last primary, that Humphrey would have still been the nominee?
Great. So you must be a journalist, because journalists always ask a question that turns into two, and those are two good ones, and I'm going to try to remember them. And the first one was about Gene McCarthy. And it was true generally with Bobby Kennedy that he was the one of the Kennedy brothers who people came away feeling either loving or hating, but in a way that Jack could charm anybody and people, including Gene McCarthy. And I can assure you that Jack Kennedy disliked Gene McCarthy as much as Bobby did, but McCarthy would never have known that. And that was a perfect thing when Bobby Kennedy was his brother's campaign manager, because he was a lightning rod. Everybody came away with Bobby saying no and Jack saying yes, and that was what you want in that kind of situation. Bobby Kennedy disliked Gene McCarthy for partly competitive reasons. They were both Catholics. They both thought that they were sort of the real thing, and including in the anti-war movement. And yet Bobby Kennedy disliked Gene McCarthy for what I think was a very legitimate reason as well, which is Gene McCarthy was a one-issue candidate. He was right on the war, and I think he was not an advocate for civil rights or for poverty or for lots of things the way that Bobby had been. And and they can say this maybe 50 years later safely, but from Sam Brown to lots of the other leading people in the Gene McCarthy campaign, they said after California, they were going with Bobby. And they were going with Bobby for two reasons, not just because they thought he could win, which was true, but because they thought that he was more the real deal, that their time with McCarthy had convinced him he was a great guy and he'd be a great college professor, but not a president. And the other question was about, could he have won? So what was due to happen, he said on to Chicago, he was due to fly to Chicago the next morning. And one of the people I interviewed for this book is a guy named Bill Daley, who was the son of the then mayor of Chicago, Obama's chief of staff for a while. And Bill Daley says there was a 70% or greater chance that the next day his dad was going to endorse Bobby Kennedy for president. And if you remember back to 1968, there was no more powerful figure in the Democratic establishment than Bill Daley. And I've had other people who were involved in politics in cities ranging from New York to Philadelphia to other places tell me that they think that the establishment would have come around to Bobby Kennedy, in part because they had no choice. As you say, Humphrey had not won a single vote, and the idea of it was one thing to buck Gene McCarthy at the convention. It would have been a very different thing to try to buck Bobby Kennedy. So I'm convinced, and nobody can prove me wrong, that the ticket would have been that year one of two things, because this is what Democrats did back then. It would have either been a Bobby Kennedy-Hubert Humphrey ticket or a Hubert Humphrey-Bobby Kennedy ticket. And I can assure you that there was no person alive in America in 1968 who understood Richard Nixon's vulnerabilities better than the guy who 8 years before had won his brother's campaign, had steered his brother's successful campaign against Richard Nixon. And Bobby Kennedy was chomping to get at Nixon. And I think from Nixon's memoir and from things that Nixon has been quoted all over the place in saying that he was scared as hell, that Humphrey was the preferred opponent that year. And Bobby Kennedy, he knew. Nixon said, you remember Nixon's, the reputation, the nickname they stuck Nixon with? Anybody remember what it was? Tricky Dick. Well, he said, I learned all my tricks from 1960 and what Bobby Kennedy did on behalf of his brother Jack. And he was right. And he knew that Bobby Kennedy not only was a formidable candidate, but he knew the behind-the-scenes stuff. The famous debate, everybody remembers the famous presidential debate. So you know what Bobby Kennedy said to Nixon? Nixon had come out of the hospital for, I think, some knee issue that he had had, and he was pale, and he looked bad, and he had a 5 o'clock shadow. And Nixon goes up to Bobby Kennedy just before he goes on camera and says, how do I look? And Bobby says, you look marvelous. Jack Kennedy comes up just before he goes on camera, and Bobby says, kick him in the balls. So Nixon looked terrible. Jack did kick him And we all know what Bobby was behind every tough thing that happened in that campaign. So I think we would have ended up with Bobby Kennedy as president, and you can all imagine much better than I can what America might have looked like, not just back then, but what we might look like today had we had Bobby Kennedy addressing the issues that are still on the table 50 years later. If we had taken on racial intolerance and other issues 50 years earlier, we might be a different country today. Sir?
Would you talk a little bit about Bobby Kennedy's role during the Cuban Missile Crisis?
So I will. And so during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I want to give you two versions of Bobby Kennedy's role. One is the version that Bobby Kennedy wrote up in his famous and very successful book, 13 Days, which was, at that time, the only insider version we had of the missile crisis. And the star of the missile crisis was only partly Jack Kennedy. The real star was the guy whispering in his ear, Bobby Kennedy, who was, according to this version, a wonderful dove from the beginning, saying the way we deal with Cuba is we don't attack them, we blockade them, and we'll avoid any kind of military confrontation. And that was a great version. And it would have been a great version, and it would be the version I'm telling you today is the official version, except that there were these secret tape recordings that thankfully NARA and that became public. And I don't know what Bobby was thinking when he wrote his version, because he knew, very few people knew about those recordings, but Bobby did. And those versions tell a very different story. They show that at the end of the crisis, at the end of the 13 days, he was in fact calling for the blockade. But at the beginning, he was saying the way we do it is we go in and we have an airstrike. And he sounded like not quite Curtis LeMay, but sort of Dr. Strangelove, not far removed. And he was just different. And if you were sympathetic or you were a good spinmeister, you could say he was just playing a devil's advocate. But that's not the way it sounded when he was arguing this stuff. He believed in that stuff. And over the course of the crisis, he changed. And his role was partly one at the end of being the ultimate peacemaker, because he was the one who went to Dobrynin and did all the negotiation with the Soviets. But there was one other piece that he didn't tell us. And this is Bobby Kennedy looking ahead to his own political future. The Cuban Missile Crisis, and this was, I think, a tragic error that people at the time didn't understand, including Lyndon Johnson, because he didn't know the full story. The official version that the Kennedys put out at that time that was accepted in Bobby's book and in the movie made of that book and everywhere else was that we won the Cuban Missile Crisis by staring down the Soviets. And we said unilaterally, you will take your missiles out of Cuba or else. And they took them out of Cuba. The true story that we now know is that we traded our missiles, our Jupiter missiles in Turkey, for them taking their missiles out of Cuba. But Bobby, if you believe Ambassador Dobrynin in his memoir, Bobby went there and said, look, for this deal to work, we have to make it look like this is not a quid pro quo. You take your missiles out of Cuba, you take your missiles out of Cuba, and we will, months later, look like, as a goodwill gesture, we'll take our missiles out of Turkey. That's not the way it was negotiated, and that's not the way Bobby told the story, but it is factual. One last thing, and this is a longer answer than you wanted, but I can't resist. One last thing is, Bobby never told us the true story of how we got into the missile crisis. Was it these mean Russians that unilaterally decided we're going to put missiles in Cuba and rattle the sabers of America? And that's the way the story was told in the press and everywhere else. The truth is that a guy named Bobby Kennedy had been leading for a year a secret war against Cuba called Operation Mongoose. Thanks again to the archives, we now have all the records of that. And Operation Mongoose was trying not just to sabotage the crops and to undermine the economy, it was probably trying to assassinate Fidel Castro. And Bobby Kennedy was part of that whole enterprise. So the Cubans and the Russians got the missiles to Cuba because it looked like they needed missiles there to protect them against the saber-rattling Attorney General and President of the United States. And that's a story that wasn't told then. And that's a story that I got to tell you that the Bobby Kennedy of 1968 would want me up on stage telling that version of the story, because by then he was admitting his mistakes to just about everything, from wiretapping Martin Luther King to getting us into Vietnam, helping get us into Vietnam. He was one of the only people in the history of the Senate who had the courage to stand up and say, mea culpa, mea culpa. I created this problem, and now let's get it solved. So anyway, sorry.
Yes. Can you talk about the Oregon primary? I think it was the first time Kennedy was defeated. And did RFK vote for Eisenhower in '56? Would you know?
Yeah, great. So great on both of those. And the Oregon primary. So I said earlier that New York would have been the first time that Kennedy was ever defeated if Bobby had lost the Senate race. That's the way the story's been repeated forever. The truth is, Jack Kennedy, as all of you are smart enough to know, ran for vice president on Adlai Stevenson's ticket, and he was defeated. And I think that Joe Kennedy may have helped engineer that defeat because he thought it was the worst decision ever for him to want to be on a ticket with Adlai Stevenson, who he knew would not just lose, but would lose historically badly. And so, but Oregon primary, Bobby Kennedy fought like hell in Oregon. He had a lousy campaign. There was a congresswoman named Edith Green who kept out all of the Bobby partisans from Massachusetts who knew how to run a campaign. They ran a bad campaign. Bobby said, this is not my kind of audience, that it was a nearly all-white, gun-toting Oregonians, and they were just not his kind of people. He also made a number of really bad tactical mistakes. He wouldn't debate McCarthy there. He ran a lousy campaign. He learned the lesson. He didn't make those mistakes in California. Every politician should lose an election, or at least one primary, so they know how to win the rest of them. And Bobby was much too smart not to learn from those kinds of errors. And the question was, did he vote in 1956 for Eisenhower? And the answer is, I'd have to go back and look at my footnotes on why I know this. But I was wary of repeating the oft-told story that he did that because it made him look like a cynic. You know, he was out there working for Stevenson, and would he vote for Eisenhower? And I can't remember who it was, and I don't want to credit Ethel if she wasn't the one. But in the footnotes in my book, this is a way of saying, yes, you have to read the book. But it's there how I know, and I'm almost certain that he did vote for Eisenhower. Yeah, and it was a cynical thing to do. But he was in 1956. All that mattered in the world to him, this is the way he was brought up. All that mattered was that his brother be president in 4 years. It didn't matter whether Adlai Stevenson lose by 1 million votes or 20 million votes.
A topical question. What role did Bobby Kennedy play covering up his brother's serious health problems, Addison disease and the others?
Yes. So
what was their attitude towards keeping it? Why did they and every other president we've had keep all these health issues secret?
So I want to answer that, but before I do, I want to say that the moment that I heard on Sunday about the Hillary Clinton collapsing or whatever she did, the teetering, I thought of Bobby in 1968. And Bobby Kennedy, who nobody accused of not being the healthiest guy who's ever run for president at age 42, in the California primary, he was so overworked. He didn't have pneumonia, but he had laryngitis throughout the campaign, and he was so overworked that he collapsed on stage one night, and it was really horrible. And I thought of that when I thought of Hillary, and I wanted to go write an instantaneous op-ed saying you don't have to be 70, whatever she is, to collapse like that, or 68, yes, that you can be 42 years old. The rigors of being out there day after day in the campaign, combined with having some sort of an infection, were extraordinary. But the answer on the Addison's disease, everybody knows what Addison's is. It's an adrenal condition that nobody in America seemed to know much about in 1960. And Bobby Kennedy and Jack Kennedy absolutely lied to everybody. Bobby said, and I would have to get the exact quote in the book, he said, my brother does not have or ever had a serious adrenal condition known as such and such. Or he phrased it in a way that he was lying and being technically accurate at the same time. And everybody knew that. And it was especially disingenuous because everybody in the Kennedy camp was trying to use LBJ's family history of heart disease against Lyndon Johnson. And it was just, but in those days, everybody threw mud and lied, and it was much harder to find out about it. Today, anybody who lies is likely to be discovered not 20 years later when a historian is looking at it, but 20 minutes later when somebody leaks the medical record or whatever. So yes, he lied. He set a pattern for how to tell the most creative lies that have ever been told in a campaign, including a story that I won't bore you with now, but how Jack Kennedy really won that campaign. It was not by stealing votes from graveyards in Chicago. It was not by the televised debate. It was by what Dwight Eisenhower called a couple of phone calls, one of which Bobby Kennedy made behind the scenes to the sentencing judge in Atlanta, Georgia, to get Martin Luther King out of jail. And it was an extraordinary thing. And Martin Luther King got out of jail that last weekend of the campaign when it looked too close to call. In every black church, in every black bar room, in every what they called then coloreds-only setting in America, leaflets went out saying, will you vote for no comment Nixon, because Nixon had given no comment when he asked what he thought about Martin Luther King being arrested, or will you vote for the candidate with a heart who got Martin Luther King out of jail, Jack Kennedy? And 4 or 5 states that were the critical states, it was not only Illinois back then, it was, according to Theodore White, 4 or 5 states. All Richard Nixon had to do to win those states and to win the presidency was to get the same percentage of the black vote that Eisenhower and Nixon had gotten in 1956. He didn't. Those phone calls led to soaring black vote in those states, and that is what decided the election in 1960. And it was an extraordinary behind-the-scenes phone call. Anybody a lawyer in this audience? Great. So anybody, you don't have to be a lawyer to know that a lawyer calling a sentencing judge behind the scenes, telling him, among other things, if we get elected, you'll be welcome to the White House anytime you want. That was not exactly an ethical way that the Bar Association would approve of, but it worked.
Could you tell us your view as to why Sirhan killed Bobby Kennedy?
So the assassination question, I don't want to get into because I don't have anything new to add. And what I will say about that is that all the people who could have answered the question, a lot of smart people have raised questions about it, and all the people who I think could have answered it are long dead. And I had gotten Sirhan's lawyer to agree at one point to give me an interview, but I wouldn't believe anything he told me anyway. And I guess I want to change your question around because I can't enlighten you on anything that you're really asking. But I want to say that it was one of the most tragic ironies of the Kennedy family story, which is filled with tragedy. One of the most tragic ironies is that Bobby and Jack spent their early political years trying to outrace the legitimate stigma that they had from Joe Kennedy of being anti-Semitic. The father was clearly an anti-Semite. We know that from his letters and from everything else. And the sons had to run away from that stigma. And the idea that 25 years later, Bobby would be killed by a Palestinian activist for being too pro-Semitic is just it's one more Kennedy tragedy. And it just makes me again want to cry. That was exactly the note that Sirhan left, saying, you know, he supported Israel and he did all these things. And the Kennedys, in lots of ways, couldn't win either way on the really important things, the life and death things. So what I would like to do now is just say thank you all for coming. We've got books somewhere out there. I'd love to sign if you want to buy, and you've been a great audience.